Hi, I'm Joe Stark, creator of the fantasy adventure series The Unscarred. If you like what you hear today, be sure to like, subscribe, and share. Now, on to the show.
On the world of Faereyas, a god made flesh is born every 500 years. These beings are known as the Chosen, but the world will come to call one of them the Unscarred. The Unscarred, written by Joe Stark.
Chapter 10 Death Incarnate. Althenia paused at the threshold to Ordwalk's suite. She and Hawk had worked late into the night preparing for the coming morning. She took a moment to compose herself, then smiled broadly as she opened the door. A young man looked up, turning his attention from a book that lay open on his desktop. "Hello there," said Althenia. "Are you Warren?" The young man nodded. "That's right. How can I help you?" asked Warren as he stood and turned to face his guest. Althenia stepped forward and extended her hand. "I'm Althenia. I've been assigned to assist Heiress Hawk and was told that you could show me around." Warren took Althenia's offered hand. Standing so closely to the young woman, he noticed that she smelled like sunshine and lilacs. He lightly shook her hand. "You've been assigned to assist Hawk?" asked Warren. "That's right," replied Althenia with a smile. "It's all been rather sudden, but Hawk asked me herself. I was quite honored." Warren observed that she had dimples when she smiled. He grinned in return as he nodded his head. "Good for you," he exclaimed. "I'd be happy to help you with anything you need." Althenia continued to smile as she looked into Warren's eyes. "Well, actually, I'm new to Terransay, and what time I've spent here has been in the lower vaults, so I must confess, I get lost easily up here," said Althenia, blushing in embarrassment. Warren puffed out his chest. "Worry not," he exclaimed in mock bravado. "I know all the secret routes." Althenia clapped in appreciation. "If you're not too busy, would you mind showing me?" she asked. Warren looked back to his desk for a moment with a pained expression on his face, before shaking his head. Of course, he replied with a smile. "No time like the present." "Splendid," said Althenia. "Lead the way, good sir." Warren gave a short bow and they both laughed. "This way, madame," said Warren theatrically as he held open the door for her. Althenia gave another big smile as she followed the young man through the door and into the hall, waiting as Warren locked the door behind them with a small metal key. Hawk watched from a distance as Althenia and Warren disappeared around a corner. She made her way to Ordwalk's suite and stopped before the locked door. Hawk quietly spoke a series of incantations, and a soft click sound issued from the lock as the door opened. She crossed the threshold and quickly closed the door behind her. Hawk navigated her way through Ordwalk's suite, and in short order she stood before the now familiar illusion depicting her great-grandfather's portrait. She spoke an incantation and her vision changed, allowing her to see the nexus of energy that she sought. Reaching into her pocket, she pulled forth a round wooden tea coaster. Hawk and Althenia had worked late into the night, unraveling the tangle of energies as it existed within Hawk's memory. Through trial and error, the pair of young mages learned that the strands of spellwork within the nexus point were simply out of place, and needed to be coaxed into the proper alignment. Hawk crafted a construct to mimic the alignment and imprinted the signature on the closest object at hand, the tea coaster from her desk. She placed the wooden coaster flat against the wall, covering the nexus point with the small disc. Hawk slowly turned the coaster, It suddenly locked into place as the energy signature from her construct untangled and aligned to the threads of spellcraft. The illusion faded away to reveal a shallow alcove set within the wall. At its back stood a bookcase heavy with volumes and an armoire adorned with thick wrought ironwork. Hawk scanned through the titles on the shelf. Many were restricted volumes familiar to her, though a few caught her attention. The missing volumes on Kalan's early life. Hawk pulled the books from the shelf and carefully placed them in a bag slung over her shoulder. She returned her attention to the bookcase and spoke a series of incantations. The voids left from her pilfering filled in with color and form, mimicking the appearance of the missing volumes as Hawk cast her own illusion spell. Hawk smiled in satisfaction at the circular nature of her ruse. Ordwak had hidden his theft behind an illusion, and she had done the very same, an illusion within an illusion. Content with her recovery of the missing works of Kalan, Hawk began to make her exit when her curiosity made her pause. She turned her attention to the armoire and examined the doors. Her enhanced vision couldn't detect any spellcraft. Hawk tried the handle, but the heavy door wouldn't budge. Hawk considered her options. She had what she'd come for, but the presence of a locked armoire hidden behind a sophisticated false wall bespoke of secrets yet untold. What could Ordwak be hiding in there, she thought to herself. Though she knew it to be in contradiction to her and Althenia's plan, the allure of the locked armoire was too great to abandon. Hawk needed to know what secrets lay within. She only hoped that Althenia could keep Warren occupied a little longer. Althenia covered her mouth as she giggled. Warren blushed in reaction to the young woman's attention. She smiled, and Warren resumed his explanation of her expected duties as Hawk's assistant. Althenia had quickly surmised that she made the young man nervous. Throughout their walk, Warren had vacillated between incessant chatter and moments of thunderstruck gazing that Althenia patiently endured. The pair rounded a corner and entered the gathering square outside of the conclave's chambers. Sunlight filtered into the square from mirrored reflection channels built into the tower walls. The square was bustling with people. Vendors sold food goods and various wares from carts. A large circular fountain dominated the center of the square. Althenia and Warren took seats along the fountain's perimeter. The splashing sound of water mixed with the overlapping voices of the crowd, filling the square with its chaotic din. From her vantage point, Althenia was able to occupy Warren while also keeping a lookout for Ordwak. She glanced at the timepiece set high above the fountain. 30 more minutes, thought Althenia. Though she knew their timetable relied only upon Hawk's estimate of the morning's conclave business, should the session run short, she must be ready to delay Ordwak, and when needed, warn Hawk of his approach. Warren had fallen silent and was once again looking at Althenia with a dumbfounded gaze. She smiled and reached across the table, giving Warren's hand a brief squeeze. The young man's eyes widened in surprise at the unexpected contact. "This is all so amazing," said Althenia. "You must tell me more." Warren smiled and launched into an explanation of the history of the square's fountain. Althenia smiled in return as she appeared to hang upon the young man's every word, though her gaze occasionally lingered upon the conclave's chamber door. Hawk sighed in exasperation as she stared at the heavy wooden doors before her. Despite her best attempts, the armoire had proven resistant to her probing. "No visible locks, no apparent spellcraft," observed Hawk. "How do you open?" A soft click sounded from within the armoire and the doors swung outward. Mused Hawk, pondering a moment. "Close." The armoire doors swung shut. "Open," commanded Hawk. The doors again swung open. "An undetectable enchantment!" exclaimed Hawk with a laugh. "You are a most curious wardrobe, aren't you?" she posed aloud. Pushing aside the allure of yet another mystery to be explored, she surveyed the contents within. Books, scrolls, and devices were neatly tucked into cubbyholes and shelves. Hawk's attention was drawn to a large wooden cube tucked away in a bottom corner. She knelt and slid the cube out of the armoire and onto the floor. To all outward appearance, it seemed to be a solid piece of stonewood. Hawk examined the cube with her enhanced sight and found a latticework of energies running through the wood grain. The threads were spread across the top of the cube like a coarsely woven cloth. Hawk touched a thread with her index finger. It moved at her touch, sliding and bunching against the surrounding threads, which in turn moved other threads. She lifted her hand and the latticework of energy snapped back into its original alignment. Hawk spoke a series of incantations over the cube, and it began to glow with a soft blue phosphorescence. The light coalesced and formed into lines streaking across the surface, tracing the points of contact from when the cube was last touched. Hawk spoke another word, and the lights slowed in their pace. She studied the movements of the lights for a moment before saying another word of power, causing the lights to vanish. Hawk spread her fingers over the surface of the cube, making deliberate contact with several points. She dragged and spun her fingers, following the light patterns revealed by her spellcraft. The seamless surface of the cube split, revealing a lidded opening. Althenia perused the wares laid out on the cart before her. The vendor, a purveyor of stonewood jewelry and trinkets, watched with a hopeful smile at the prospect of making a sale. She was one of many such sellers peddling wares from wooden carts. Warren explained the permit process for the sellers in the square, while Althenia wore the mask of an avid listener, all the while carefully positioning herself to watch the conclave's chamber door as the pair drifted from cart to cart. Althenia smiled politely and thanked the vendor before walking away. She approached an adjacent cart and made a show of fawning over the seller's selection of bottled potions. Warren carried on with his explanation, pointing out the differences in permits between sellers of magical and non-magical wares. The sound of a gong reverberated through the square as the conclave chamber doors opened. A stream of people began to pour from the open chamber. Althenia watched with rapt attention as the flow of people slowed to a trickle, when finally she spotted him. Ordwalk was trailed by a small group of finely robed men. He suddenly stopped when he spotted Warren and Althenia. Ordwalk motioned to the men around him, and they dispersed, leaving the old man alone. He smiled kindly to people in the crowd as he made his way to where Warren and Althenia waited. "Althenia, may I present to you the esteemed Lord Ordwalk of House Kalan," said Warren in introduction as Ordwalk approached. "My lord," said Althenia as she curtsied. Ordwalk ignored the exchange and stepped close to Warren. "What are you doing here?" hissed Ordwalk, his voice barely above a whisper. "Well, I am," began Warren, but he was quickly interrupted by the older man. "You're fucking about in the square with a pretty girl and not minding your desk. Is that what I'm seeing right now, Warren?" "My apologies, sir," said Warren. "The pretty girl, Althenia, has been assigned as Hawk's new assistant, and I was asked to show her around." "Hawk's new assistant," replied Ordwalk in confusion. "Yes, sir," said Warren. "This is her, Althenia." Althenia again curtsied as Ordwalk's eyes fell upon her. "It is truly an honor to meet you, Lord Ordwalk. I'm afraid that it is my fault that Warren is here. I am new to Terransay and do not yet know my way around." Ordwalk's eyes narrowed as recognition dawned upon him. "Yes, I'm sure this is quite a difference from the lower vaults, which begs the question, why would Hawk wish to have an assistant who doesn't know her way around the tower? And I presume you won't often be sent on idle-minded shopping trips through the square, so what exactly is Warren teaching you here, miss?" "Oh, Warren was just explaining the permit process for sellers operating within the square," said Althenia with a smile. "He has been so generous with his time." "I see," replied Ordwalk as he glared at Warren. "Well, I expect the two of you will be working quite closely in the future, but we must get back to work now. Much to do," he said, giving Althenia a cold smile. As Ordwalk and Warren disappeared into the crowded square, Althenia squeezed the ring on her finger. If everything had gone to plan, Hawk would already be back in her quarters, but if not, she had only minutes to vacate Ordwalk's suite before he returned. Althenia prayed that Hawk felt the signal. Hawk smiled in satisfaction. She reached to open the lid when she felt the ring on her finger gently constrict once, twice, and then a third time. "Shit," she thought to herself. "He's coming." Hawk hastily threw the lid open and blinked in surprise. The stonewood box was filled with golden bars, each stamped with the crest of Car-2. Atop the gold was an ornate ivory tube with golden caps on either end. Hawk picked up the tube and opened it. A roll of parchment was tucked within. She unrolled it, seeing it to be a letter addressed to Ordwalk. Her face went ashen as she quickly scanned through the flowing script. Hawk looked at the gold with disgust. It was a bribe from Zarin Zaris. She tucked the letter into her pocket and returned the stonewood box to its place on the shelf. "Close," said Hawk. The armoire doors neatly snapped shut. Hawk quickly set about restoring the illusion, and in short order, Salat's unpleasant face once again adorned the stone wall. She turned to leave, but stopped as she heard the outer door to Ordwalk's suite open. The muffled voice of her father drifted through the door as he chastised Warren. "Shit, I'm trapped," she thought to herself. Hawke considered her options. Ordwalk mustn't know of her discovery of his treason. As one of a bonded pair, she could jump to her room, but it was risky to jump without the benefit of Hoke's sight into the space she'd be jumping. The slightest miscalculation could cause her to materialize inside a solid wall. Hawke closed her eyes in concentration. She bent her knees and sank into a crouch as she took a deep, calming breath. She exhaled and suddenly exploded upward with a powerful jump. As the room shifted and swirled around her, Hawke disappeared from Ordwalk's suite and reappeared above the training circle in her room. She dropped to the floor and landed lightly upon her feet. Breathing a sigh of relief, she dropped to the floor. As she stared at the heavy wooden beams above her, she considered the weight of her discovery and shook her head in resignation to the truth. Ordwalk would do anything for power, even betray his own people. Hoke pushed his way through a tangle of thorn bushes. The small animals that had created the trail he followed were able to duck beneath the thorny mass, but he wasn't of a mind to crawl through. He pushed the encounter with Daleth from his mind. The Ka had proven to be an aggravating distraction in a dangerous environment, the worst kind of partner. Hoke kicked at the thorns, but the thicket held tight, blocking his path. He reached for his sword, but stopped short at the sound of Daleth screaming. Hoke froze. This wasn't the Ka's usual shouts of frustration. This was a scream of injury, of mortal peril. Hoke swiftly drew his sword as he turned and charged through the underbrush. The scream was close, he thought to himself as he ran. If he isn't in the meadow, then he's surely just within the tree line beyond. Hoke burst through the tree line and quickly swept his gaze across the meadow. His breath froze in his chest as he caught sight of Daleth. The young Ka warrior was on the ground beneath the great stonewood. A black mantis stood atop him, pinning him against the gnarled roots. The mantis raised its barbed forelegs to the sky, and Hoke again felt the strange tingling in his chest. Daleth screamed in pain, jolting Hoke into action. Hoke pulled his dagger and flung it at the mantis as he charged forward. The blade glanced off the creature's chitinous exoskeleton, but it had the desired effect. The old beast spun to engage the new threat. A low hissing sound emanated from the black mantis as it fixed its alien eyes upon the approaching Farron. Hoke let loose a scream as he continued his charge. He ran in a straight line directly at the creature, but leapt to his left as he closed the distance, swinging his sword in a downward arc through the space his body had just occupied. The blade clanged loudly, making contact with the black mantis as it lunged forward. The beast continued to hiss as Hoke slowly circled, just out of reach. From his peripheral vision, he saw Daleth crawl and drag himself into a nook within the mass of stonewood roots. With the injured Ka safely out of the way, Hoke felt freer in his movements. He wouldn't need to keep himself between Daleth and the creature. The black mantis suddenly darted forward. Hoke raised his sword, barely catching the first of 3 rapid blows. On instinct, he swung his sword and stepped back and left, again catching the mantis's blow on his blade. The creature again darted forward, striking low. Hoke defended the attack and quickly swept his blade up as he spun right, catching another strike from the black mantis. Hoke allowed himself a momentary smile. The movement was deadly fast, but the sequence of attacks and misdirection followed the same patterns as the forms drilled into Hoke during his training. Hoke continued to observe the patterns as the black mantis launched another series of attacks. Block, block, twist and lunge to riposte. Another attack thwarted. Again the mantis flashed forward, lashing out with barbed forelegs. Hoke blocked and quickly returned to counterstrike, catching the creature in its blind spot. His blade glanced off the armored hide, but carried enough force to knock the beast back. The black mantis reared up on its back legs and stretched itself to its full height, towering over the Farron as it shook its head. A deep rattling sounded from the creature's abdomen as though it were bellowing a challenge to the warrior before it. With a sudden and renewed ferocity, the mantis charged forward. Hoke's blade was a blur in the midday sun as he focused all his attention on defending against the furious onslaught. He silently thanked Corso as he swiftly blocked and countered each attack. The efforts of thousands of hours of training, working, and refining his form over years of constant pressure from a relentless swordmaster had honed his body and mind. His sword no longer a tool to be grasped, but an extension of his arm. The old beast backed off and again stared down the Farron, clacking its mandibles together as though in irritation. The ominous hissing sound suddenly fell silent as the black mantis retreated into the shadow of the great stonewood and quickly scampered up the thick trunk, disappearing from sight in the leafy, dark blue canopy above. Hoke kept his blade at the ready as he warily scanned the branches extending over his head. The great stonewood towered over the meadow, its canopy extending well over 100 feet away from the trunk in every direction. Hoke knew an ambush from above was imminent. He once again felt the tingling sensation in his chest. The feeling suddenly intensified as the sound of snapping branches filtered through the leafy boughs. Hoke's eyes darted toward the source of the sound, but immediately recognized it as a feint. He quickly turned and swung his sword in a powerful arc, striking the black mantis as it silently dropped onto him from above. Hoke's sword was torn from his grasp as the beast reared back, the blade firmly lodged between its horned head and lengthy thorax. The black mantis raised its barbed forelegs to the sky as though in prayer. Burning pain flared across Hoke's chest as the ground around him shuddered and collapsed, dropping the Farron into a shallow declivity. Before. Cold winds assaulted the travelers. They had just reached the edge of a small clearing within a dense stand of pines when the sudden gusts befell them. Hoke drew his cloak tightly around his shoulders as they approached a small hut in the center of the clearing. Corso glanced over his shoulder and laughed at his younger companion's discomfort. "Sorry about that, mate. It's easy to forget after so many years," said the old captain cryptically, his voice nearly lost in the fierce winds. Hoke said nothing in return. His gaze was fixed upon the hut. He fervently hoped the interior would be as warm as the cheerful light spilling from the glazed windows promised. In short order, the pair of travelers were inside. Hoke quickly approached the blazing hearth and warmed his frigid fingers. "The chill winds get you, boy," a dry voice croaked from a darkened doorway. An old woman emerged from the darkness. She was as tall and slender as she was frail and wizened, with a lined and wrinkled face and silvery white hair. She looked Hoke over with her piercing blue eyes. She turned away without further words and settled her gaze upon Corso. "It has been some time, Corso. It is good to see you well. I trust the breeze bothered you not," said the old woman as a wry smile crossed her lips. Corso bowed in respect. "May the Creator's blessings be upon you." "And upon you, child," she replied. Fixing Corso with a stern look, she motioned toward Hoke. "You've taught him the old ways, then?" Corso nodded. "Aye, all 12 forms." The old woman smiled and nodded in return. "And so, the old ways live on," she intoned. "The old ways live on," repeated Corso. Hoke listened to the exchange with curious interest. The old ways harkened back to the first age of Faereyas when the Ka pacified Karas Fan, and were ruled by wizard kings waging wars against the Chaos Lords of the southern continent, the Ka warriors marked with runes of protection against elemental chaos magic. Those histories were among the few books in the Terransay libraries that he had devoured without complaint. The old woman fixed Hoke with a stern gaze. "You have learned the sword forms of the old ways, taught by one who learned from another. The chain remains unbroken." She approached the young Farron and drew open the front of his tunic. He jerked at the unexpected contact, but she placated him with another stern look and placed her hand upon his chest. She closed her eyes and spoke a series of incantations in a strange language. Hoke felt a prickly sensation across the skin of his chest as she continued to incant. A circle of runes appeared on his chest as though tattooed by needle and ink. A warm feeling settled over his body as her voice fell silent. "You've been marked, Hoke of Terransay. May it protect you. Now." Hoke stared in shock at the black mantis looming over him. Its barbed forearms were still raised to the sky. From the state of the crushed and impacted soil around him, he surmised that the beast had conjured a gravity spell of some kind, drawing upon elemental magic. Hoke suddenly understood the sensations he'd been feeling in his chest. It was his protection runes reacting to the presence of elemental magic, but crucially, it left him unaffected by the mantis's spell. From his peripheral vision, Hoke spied the hilt of Daleth's sword overhanging the rim of the shallow hole where he lay. The Farron jolted upright. He gripped the Ka's sword and swung with as much strength as he could muster. The curved blade struck the black mantis, separating the beast's head from its thorax. Hoke dropped to his knees and breathed heavily. "Fuck me, you did it!" shouted Daleth as he clambered out from the cluster of stonewood roots. "I was sure we were dead. Absolutely fucked, exclaimed Daleth. Hoke helped the Ka to his feet. Daleth favored his injured leg but was able to stand. He motioned to the satchel laying among the roots nearby. Hand me that, will you? Said Daleth. Hoke retrieved the satchel and gave it to Daleth. The Ka removed a white tube, pointed it toward the sky, and pulled a small string. A blazing fireball shot from the mouth of the tube and rose high into the sky, leaving a trail of white smoke. Daleth smiled at the Farron and extended his hand. Hoke took the offered hand and the pair shook. Well done, Hoke Z Ka, said Daleth using the Farron's new Ka name. Hoke watched the plume of white smoke continue to rise over the top of the great stonewood. He sighed and felt a wave of relief flow over him. Hoke listened as Daleth recounted the battle from his perspective when realization dawned upon him. He understood the Ka's words. The activation of his protection runes had opened a new pathway to magic in his mind, and he could now recognize the flow of energy between himself and Hawk. The blaring of horns suddenly sounded, echoing off the steep cliff walls. Eric gripped the smooth stones of the parapet and scanned the valley for smoke. To the south, he spotted a column of white smoke rising from the multicolored stonewood canopy. The young chosen smiled and sighed in relief, happy in the knowledge that his friend still lived. Thank you for listening. Be sure to like, share, and leave a 5-star review for the show. If you would like a copy of the Unscarred, please see the Amazon link in the show notes. Hardcover, paperback, and digital copies are all available right now. And if you want to email the show, hit me up at erictheunscarred@gmail.com.